If you and I were to watch popular programming today and think about the deep questions we really have, we come away wondering, is there ever going to be a meeting of the minds between what, quote, spirituality has to offer and the questions of the mind and the heart, and the longest bridge that we try to build in life, the longest journey between our thinking and our feeling? The world is incredibly spinning out of control in our times. I cover this globe, I crisscross it many times every year. It is nothing for me for an average year to do 14 or 15 countries. And I recall a few years ago being in Damascus, Syria, before any of this turmoil started. It was my 6th or 7th visit to the country. Syria is a magnificent land. One of the oldest inhabited cities in the world is the city of Damascus. You can still see the street called Straight, which the Apostle Paul refers to as the place on his conversion journey, and the Damascus wall, where he was put into a basket and lowered over that wall. And yet, a few years ago when I was speaking there, I was always called up in front of the intelligence authorities. They just wanted to alert me that they were aware that I was present in their country. Always went through the proper procedures, got the proper visa, filled out the necessary documents. I never ever dodged on those issues, so I was not surprised that the day after I came, they asked if I could please report to their officers. So here they were with military generals flanking the intelligence officer, and he looked at me and he said something like this: "Whatever you do, don't get into the politics of this region." I said, "Oh no, I don't plan to, sir, and I hope you know I never have." He said, "No, I understand that, but don't get into the politics of this region. That is our warning to you." I said, "No." He said, "But Mr. Zacharias, we know who you are and what you do, and you are very welcome in our country. We hope you will keep coming back." So I said to him, "May I ask you, since I don't get into the politics of the region, but you do, can you explain to me what is going on in the Middle East right now?" And this was before most of us had ever heard of ISIS, before the turmoil, before the attempt to overthrow Assad and all of that. And he looked across the table to me and he said these words. I remember quoting it in a radio program shortly after I came back. And he said this: "If something doesn't change dramatically, this whole part of the world is going to blow up." Those were pretty strong words coming from a man who was well versed in all that was going on. I had not asked him what he meant by that. Those were his words. And shortly after the onslaught began, he was one of the first to be assassinated and eliminated. And now, of course, tens of thousands in that country have just vanished and disappeared in a slaughter that is going on, almost reminiscent of what happened in Rwanda in the mid-1990s. And the world stands back and watches, and we seem completely handcuffed to know what to do about all of this. It was Malcolm Muggeridge, who was writing in the 70s, who said this: "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." I had the privilege of being with Mr. Muggeridge just a short while before he died in 1990. He really thought that the world was skidding out of control, and he blamed it on 3 or 4 major types of institutions in our time that ultimately would lead to a worldwide carnage. That's what Muggeridge believed. He was often known for his rather pessimistic view of life, but he was also a latecomer to Christ, and in his book, Jesus Rediscovered, he tells his story, and also in his book on Mother Teresa, which he wrote, Something Beautiful for God. But 10 years before that, Dr. Martin Luther King, when he received the Nobel Prize for Peace, said this: "I accept this award today with an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life which surrounds him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. 1964. Unarmed truth and unconditional love. I want to pause and ask you this question right from the beginning. Think of those two phrases, unarmed truth and unconditional love. When our entire cultural ethos is now being defined in a naturalistic framework with a scientific single vision, where naturalists think in grabbing the finger of one discipline, they are grabbing the entire fist of reality. What does that discipline have to say about unarmed truth and unconditional love, when both of those are metaphysical, if not spiritual, propositions? Whatever does unconditional love mean? What does unarmed truth mean, and why so? So as we head at a higher speed now because of the rapidity of change, and as someone has said, the faster you are moving, the farther ahead you had better be able to see. As we are moving with this high speed of change, are we aware of all that we are bringing about in our time? The weapons of warfare multiply rapidly, and those in control of the armaments are getting less and less accountable. It was Aldous Huxley writing in 1946 who said, "We are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends." It's given us great means. How are we going to define the ends? One of the great privileges of a university is that you study different disciplines so that you can find the unity in the diversity of the disciplines you study, and not allow just one single discipline to run away with a hegemonous goal in mind to dominate all of the interpretations of life. The realities before us are huge and massive. And if you take that macrocosmic view and then filter it down right at the tip of the funnel to the other end of it, what do I hear more often than anything else as I travel? And my colleagues will tell you the same thing, whether we are at Uppsala University in Europe, or in one of the universities of India or the Middle East or in Asia or here. The bottom line for most young men and women today is the quest for meaning. What is it that my life really means, and where do I find the source of meaning? On the opening engagement that I had this year, I've never spoken to such a vast, just once maybe before that, larger than that, but I was speaking to 40,000 university students in one setting on the 4th of January this year. They were in 3 different venues in a live audience, and then tens of thousands scattered across the globe. Now, there were, I think, 115 universities represented in that audience, over 40 different countries. And those who came to people for help, asking their questions. Fascinating what the top 2 questions were from this age bracket of 18 to 24. You might never guess it. The number 1 question was how to deal with the enslavement of pornography. Number 2, how to resist the urge to kill myself. Sensuality and suicide were the 2 major issues in the mind of the young. I don't know if they saw the connection. I am one of those who came to know Jesus Christ from a bed of suicide at the age of 17 when I lay in a hospital bed in Delhi. I know what that urge is all about. when all hope goes away and shame takes over and you really don't want to face another day. But I wonder if they saw the connection. In the first, you really dehumanize and denude somebody else. In the second, you've ultimately dehumanized yourself and denuded yourself of any value. So you see, while politicians wrestle with the horizontal axis of right and left, they have forgotten that there is an up and a down.
Welcome to the RZIM Academy core module. This is a training program for helping people to become more effective in pointing people to Jesus Christ. As you go through this course, you become better equipped to reach out to the people around you and have enjoyable, meaningful conversations with them about Jesus.
This is the task of Christian apologetics, to enable you to be more effective communicators of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Register at rzimacademy.org.
I want to answer for you from the Judeo-Christian vantage point, what does it mean to be human? What gives human life value? As I've looked at different worldviews and studied different worldviews, I have never found such a coherent set of answers as that which comes to us as presented in the gospel narrative and in the teachings of Jesus Christ. See, C.S. Lewis put it in these words. He said, when a ship goes into the high seas, it has to answer three questions. Number one, how to keep from sinking. He said that's personal ethics. Number two, how to keep from bumping into other ships. That's social ethics. He said number three is the most important of them all. Why is it out there in the first place? That is essential ethics. That's where you get your categories from. Why are we out there in the first place? Then we learn how to keep from sinking, and finally, how to keep from bumping into other ships. Within the Judeo-Christian worldview, we have at least four major sources of inspiration that define for us who we are. The first is in the belief that we are not here by accident. We are not the random collocation of atoms. We are not a blip on the radar screen of time, or an empty bubble floating on the sea of nothingness. We are actually here by design, the design of a creator. And in that created order, we are given the purpose for why we were created. And in that created order, there are two implications that emerge. Number one is we are given intrinsic worth, essential worth, not extraneous worth, not worth given by states or laws or cities or cultures, but that we have intrinsic value given to us by God himself. In fact, that's how one of the conjoining of the words of worship comes together, worthship, where God himself is the ultimate worthy being, and from that we derive our very definitions. Intrinsic worth. And there are really two deductions that follow from this. First of all, let's remember what Moses gave. He gave 613 laws. That came on the heels of violating just one law. There was only one law: not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However you want to see that, the proposition is basically this: don't play God. Don't play God. Don't be the definer of good and evil. When that law was violated, do you realize how many thousands of laws we now need because every individual plays God? You get onto a plane, and they tell you not to touch, tamper, disable, or destroy the smoke detector. Why such verbosity? Just say, don't mess with it, and that's enough. Because in a court of law, a person can say, I didn't touch it, I just disabled it. I just tampered with it. So 4 different qualifications are given till in a court of law, every statement can die the death of 1,000 qualifications. One lawyer told me you can no longer safely ask somebody, were you ever alone with that person in the room? Because that person can say no, even if they were, because in his mind he can say, if I were with this person, I was not alone. So the very word alone it signifies something that the moment you say, were you ever alone with this other person, that can be messed up. So now just for our health laws, we need thousands of pages. Think of all the other laws that have to be enacted in order to cover up 1 or 2 simple laws. Don't play God. tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was violated, and look at what has happened today. A man can be beheading somebody miles away from here on television and play God. And play God. Someone else can be screaming out and saying, don't do this. This is not what God intends of us. But autonomy has moved to this direction where we have become a law unto ourselves. And the question that you and I have to ask is, what did God actually say to start with? Moses gave 613 laws because one was violated. And then Isaiah reduced them to 15. David reduced them to 11. Micah reduced them to 3, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. Jesus was asked by a clever man, which is the greatest commandment? I would have thought for Jesus to really play the cavalier man there, he could have said, there's one law and I'm going to give it to you. He didn't. He said, the laws are these of the greatest importance: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, vertical, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these two hang all of the laws and the commandments, all of the prophets and the commandments. On these two, because of the one, the second necessarily follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. For the Judeo-Christian viewpoint, these two laws are inextricably joined. If I claim to love the Lord my God with all my heart and all my soul and all my strength and violate you, I am violating the heart of that very law that I am claiming. I was just telling some friends, it's been a long time since I even mentioned this, and I used to stay in a hotel in Bangkok called the Oriental Hotel, where a friend of mine was the general manager for 40-some years, one of the finest places in the world. They have an author's wing. It's a beautiful place to write. You're looking over the magnificent Chao Phraya River, and you can sit at your desk and write. If you've been there, you know it's a splendid place. But as soon as you come out of that, about 20 paces ahead, all the guys are marketing all the stuff you can imagine. And there's a fellow I watch coming in the morning at dawn, and he'll take his incense sticks and move it around the shrine, and then take some fruit and put it there and plant it over there. Then a little later in the day, about 6 in the evening, when you walk by, he dips into his pocket as every tourist walks by and unfurls a slew of pictures of unclad men and women, asking if you'd like to go there for the night out. And he said, would you like a happy hour? So one day I stopped him. They know me from going there. I said, I feel very badly for you that you have only 1 hour that's happy every day. I said, is that all you got to give, one happy hour? I said, I'm happy every hour of the day. So after that, every time I go by, he calls all his friends, there's the man who's happy every hour of the day, So I stopped him. I said, I have a question for you. I said, I look out of my window in the morning. You take the incense and you take some fruit and you place it right by that shrine there. Am I right? He said, yes. I said, what are you doing at the end of the day? Unfurling all this stuff and selling the bodies of young men and young women. I said, I'm a Christian, you may not be, but I can tell you this, Gautama Buddha would not be very proud of you. He was just stunned. There is no intrinsic worth in merely ethical religions, because you see, ethical systems find ways of dodging the bullet, and whatever you do, you say, I will pay it in the next life, or I will do it this way, or do it that way. And the truth of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, when the Bible tells you and me that you are created imago Dei, the image of God, it pays you and me the greatest compliment. Immediately after that conversation comes another one. That was pitting law against law. This is pitting politics against politics. So they look at him and they say to him, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar, to Jesus? It's one question I so dearly wish Jesus had answered differently. Because on April 15th, you could be both rebellious and religious at the same time. And Jesus looked at him and said, do you have a coin? And a man said, yes. He said, give it to me. He said, whose image do you see on this coin? He said, it's Caesar's. He says, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is God's. The man should have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question would have been, what belongs to God? And Jesus would have said, whose image is on you? You are created as a being of intrinsic worth. And the 10 Commandments basically tell you this, that your life is sacred and all of your possessions and your activities ought to express that sacredness with which God has endowed you. Your marriage is sacred, your property is sacred, your word should be sacred, your worship sacred, and that is the heart of what Christ really points to. And so in the created order, I find that intrinsic worth, and I also have beyond that the reflective splendor. Now this is an important point. While we share with our fellow human beings all that is common in the intrinsic worth, we have what we call in the microcosm of our lives relationships that bring about a reflective splendor, either of a family or of the family tree, however you want to take it. There are particularities of value to your life and mine in a relationship more than it is just in a generality. And this is true. Well, Prime Minister Konoye of Japan, when he committed suicide, had on his night table Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, and when they found his body the next morning, they noticed the book was turned face down, and when they turned it up, he had underlined the words of what that Wilde had used there. As terrible as it was what I had done to the world, nothing was as terrible as what I had done to myself. You are a creature of value to God. You're also an entity of value to particular people in particular relationships who will care for you and walk the extra mile. My wife would have been here at this set of meetings, but she's in Toronto, Canada right now, taking care of a 96-year-old mother who was hit by a car. And she's been standing by the side of her mother for almost nonstop for the last 6 weeks. How can I leave my mom? I have to be there. Go to the other end of the spectrum. My little grandson, Jude, who is 4 now, several months ago, and he's three and a half or so, he's running around the house playing, and his mother can't find her car keys, and so she stops, my daughter Naomi stops, slaps her forehead and says, I must be losing my mind. And this little boy comes and stands in front of her and says, Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there. From the age of a 96-year-old mother who needs her daughter by her side to a little child, the Bible says, what is there in man that you're mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you visit him? Out of the mouths of infants and babes you have ordained praise. The reality of intrinsic worth. My son went to Taylor University, graduated from there some years ago. And it was a few years ago in Taylor that a real tragedy had taken place. It was in 2006, where some kids were coming back after a weekend with some staff and faculty. I forget all. They were in a vat, and an errant truck crossed over the median, slammed into them. Most of them were just smashed and killed. One student survived. And so the coroner came, identified every one of them of all that had been, all the damage that was done. And there was a young girl by the name of Laura Van Ryn that was still living, and they called the Van Ryn family, and the Van Ryn family came and spent time by her bedside for days and days and weeks and weeks. If I remember the story correctly, Laura's boyfriend was also there through much of that time, but he kept saying, her answers are not making sense. Her answers are not making sense. And they would say to him, what do you expect? She's been so battered, the hair is matted, the face is distorted, the brain is affected. Give her time, give her time. He said, no, something is not right. So finally, one day in a very coherent conversation, she looks at them and says, I don't know why you keep calling me Laura. I'm not Laura. Say, then who are you? Says, my name is Whitney. My name is Whitney Sirac. Why do you keep calling me Laura? You're not my parents. Parents were stunned. They contacted the office and then contacted the coroner, only to find out that no DNA testing had been done. He instantly lost his job. This was Whitney Sirac. This was not Laura Van Ryn. The Sirac family had to be informed that the funeral that they had and buried their daughter was not really their daughter. It was Laura in that grave. That their daughter, Whitney, is really in the hospital room recovering. And so the Van Ryns pack up their bags and go to the grave. And the Siracs leave their home and come to visit their daughter who's still alive. You see, there's a particularity to a life, and only God is big enough to give value to all of humanity and build a relationship with you individually so that you know you are cared for and loved, all of your shortcomings and weaknesses and frailties notwithstanding. When I left the hospital after having attempted to take my life in Delhi, the doctor looked at me and said this: "We've given you back your life, but we cannot make you want to live." I said, "Sir, that's been taken care of as well." When for the first time a Bible had been opened up before me. The beautiful thing about the teaching of Jesus Christ is the reminder to you and to me that the relationship he offers is a personal one, your individual worth and your individual value. And so when we see the essential intrinsic worth, we also see a reflective splendor.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia 30010.
People are interested in having a spiritual life, but treat faith more like an a la carte menu at a restaurant, choosing what they like and dismissing the rest. Cutting through the hype and seduction is the clear voice.
I've often told my colleagues, when you're speaking to people, always remember you're not answering a question, you're answering a questioner. Always remember that. You're not merely answering a question, you're answering a questioner. Behind the question is a person who has brought with himself or herself a cumulative experience, often with value-laden and hurt-laden struggles behind it. Many years ago, as I would read some of my favorite authors, one of them was James Stewart of Scotland. And he, in one of his books, The Strong Name, makes this comment about Jesus. He was the meekest and lowliest of all the sons of men, yet he spoke of coming on the clouds of heaven with the glory of God. He was so austere that evil spirits and demons cried out at his presence, and yet the little children loved to play with him and nestled in his arms. His presence at the innocent gaiety of a village wedding was like the presence of sunshine. No one was half so kind or compassionate to sinners, yet no one ever spoke such red-hot scorching words about sin. A bruised reed he would not break. His whole life was love. Yet on one occasion he demanded of the Pharisees how they ever expected to escape the damnation of hell. He was a dreamer of dreams and a seer of visions, yet for sheer stark reality, he has all of the self-styled realists soundly beaten. He was the servant of all, washing the disciples' feet, yet masterfully strode into the temple, and the hucksters and money changers fell over one another as they saw the fire blazing in his eyes. He saved others, yet at the end himself he did not save. Now listen to this line. There is nothing in history like the union of contrasts which confronts us in the Gospels. The mystery of Jesus, says Stewart, is the mystery of divine personality. He starts off by talking about a startling coalescence of contrarieties. A startling coalescence. Not a disparate idea, but a startling coalescence of contrarieties. And in the end, he says, there's nothing like this in history that sees the person of God in such stark contrast. There's a difference between a contradiction and a contrariety. Remember that. A contradiction is where there are two mutually exclusive absolutes being affirmed at the same time and in the same sense. But a contrariety is that which pulls together the two polarities of the same truth. We deal with this all the time. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Freedom gives you liberty. Holiness gives you constraint. So when we talk about, may the land be bright with freedom's holy light, isn't America's entire experiment an attempt to reconcile liberty with law? And we struggle with it. We struggle with the idea of the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of the human being. We struggle with the idea of justice and mercy. So the songwriter says, there's a kindness in God's mercy which is more than liberty. And there's that strength in his justice which calls you and me to task. So whether it's liberty or holiness at the same time, whether it's justice and mercy, we must come to terms with the contrarieties that we see in the person of Jesus Christ. If we don't see that, we are bound to be disappointed in the sum and substance of his message. Let me take you through 3 of these contrarieties with which people struggle, and then see why it is that we end up wondering if the Christian faith has disappointed us. The first is this: it is a life of meaning, but not without tears. It is a life that Jesus offers that's meaningful, but he never ever promises to us that it'll be a life free from tears. In fact, I find one of the most profound moments in Holy Writ when Jesus himself, knowing he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, wept by the grave for his friend. Because he knew this is exactly what you and I would live with. Knowing he would raise him up, he wept. And he shed those tears of loss, knowing this family would sooner or later feel the loss of their brother Lazarus, and one by one we will all be called to that moment. You know, life is often defined by people in sheerly material terms. I will plunder you as long as I can. I will indulge in rapacious act of your lives, your homes, your economy, and so on. And if I have to go, I have to go. How is life ultimately defined by these people? What does Richard Dawkins define as the essential value of life? He totally disregards the fact of evil. The fact of evil. How does he define it? You know, I've often been asked the question on the problem of evil. How can a good God allow so much of suffering and evil in this world? And when we talk about evil, we assume good. When we talk about good, we assume a moral law. When we talk about a moral law, we assume that there's a moral lawgiver. You say, why do you have to assume that? Why do you have to assume a moral lawgiver? Why can't you just stop from evil to good and good to moral law? Can you not just put the parenthesis there and stop? No, because every time the problem of evil is actually raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person, which means it attributes intrinsic worth to personhood. The intrinsic value of personhood is indispensable to the validity of the question, and naturalism cannot give you that bequest. We weep. It is a life of meaning, but not without tears. What then is the struggle in this meaning? One of the greatest Platonist philosophers, Elmer Moore, wrote this in a concluding paragraph in one of his books. Here's what he said: "My longing is for some audible voice out of the infinite silence. My longing is for some audible voice out of the infinite silence, and it rose to a pitch within me of torture, this longing. To be satisfied, I must see face to face. I must, as it were, handle and feel. And how can this be?" So this longing is so agonizing that I really want ultimately to be face to face. I need to be able to touch and feel. It's the way we are wired. It's the way we are made. And so I say to you that we have this longing, we long for meaning. And one of the poets, John Gillespie, wrote this when he had a World War II pilot. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings, and I've put my hand out and I have touched the face of God. How is that? How is that? When you talk about touching the face of God, when you talk about longing for that feeling, when you talk about longing for that reality of confrontation one-on-one, knowing that God's presence is indisputable, you're not just dealing with a theoretical idea here. I've often said this, the Hebrews, their ultimate was in light. For the Greeks, it was knowledge. For the Romans, it was glory. For the Hebrews, it was light. For the Greeks, it was knowledge. For the Romans, it was glory. The Apostle Paul, who was a Hebrew by birth, who'd studied in a Greek city and was a citizen of Rome, he says this to the church at Corinth: God, who caused the light to shine out of darkness, has caused his light to shine in our hearts, to give to us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus our Lord. So much of our Christian gospel is tied up in words, and so little of it is often stressed on how important that moment of encounter is with Jesus Christ in your own soul and in your own innermost being. I've studied philosophy, I've taught philosophy, I've done apologetics, but even when all of the arguments fade away into the distance, I'll tell you what I will never forget. I'll never forget that at the age of 17, in a hospital room in Delhi, having given up all hope and never having cracked open a Bible to read it for myself, when a man walked into the room and brought me this little red New Testament, and my mother there read it out to me, and I cried out and I said, Jesus, I don't know much about you, but if you are who you claim to be, the author of life, I want to receive you into my life, into my heart. I want to follow you. I don't know much about you, but if you are who you claim to be, please take me out of this hospital bed, and I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth. That is my commitment to you. I was 17 years old then. It transformed everything in my life, everything. There's a man in the audience here whom I happened to meet just a month ago. He's a businessman. He and his wife and his two parents drove to Toronto where I was speaking. He was a man from a Hindu background who found Christ a year ago, totally transformed his life. He brought his parents from Ottawa, and he and his wife drove from Cleveland. He's here tonight to meet up with us again. This man in his 40s. And his mother was in her 60s and came to the back room. And as we stood there and talked, she had all her questions from the study of her scriptures and so on. And then that moment came when she recognized the need to trust in Christ for herself. I tell you, in his presence here, he put his head on my shoulder and wept as his mother had the tears running down her face, and just praying that prayer to trust in Christ, to see this family totally enveloped with the transforming power of Christ. And then he goes back, and the parents go back to Ottawa, he and his wife go back to Cleveland, and he writes to me the next day, my mother said to me this in her entire life, this is the first night she'd had a totally peaceful sleep in her life. Totally peaceful rest and sleep in her life. I saw a man in China who looked at me and told me he hated Christians, didn't want to believe any of this stuff. By the end of 1 week, after sitting and listening, he came to me and said, you know, my country needs exactly what you've given here. I'm willing to invest any amount of money you ask to do, and I'll pour in a lot of it, bring your message to China. This is what my country needs. You see, it's a life that desperately searches meaning, but is not without tears. And the only way I know you begin is not with argument, it's with that relationship and with that presence that carries you through the tears. Secondly, it's a life of perfection that reaches out to the flawed, and we need to understand this. God is perfect, we are imperfect, and we are flawed. And many times, I say this very cautiously now, we see people who come into our churches and they make a big blunder in their private life. They flounder, they falter, they slip, and they stumble. And you know what? We never let them forget it. We never let them forget it. We interviewed people on the street before we addressed this subject. And when we took the roving cameras, the microphone through many parts of the southern United States, one woman said this from another part of the state. She said, from another state, she said, you know, I used to go to church. I used to believe all this. She said, I unfortunately slipped and had a momentary affair that completely destroyed my own life and my relationship. And she said, I tried to crawl my way back to God and back into life so that I could rebuild it. She said, but I was never able to attend any service without feeling that sense of condemnation and the harshness that I had failed and I'd betrayed, I'd done all this stuff. I could never be at peace again, and therefore I just stopped going. I'm not saying we extend a kind of all-embrace that it doesn't really matter. Not at all. C.S. Lewis said, I'm hardest on myself for my own private life, but I've learned to be much patient with other people in their private lives and recognize that the hand of grace and the arms of grace need to be reaching out to people across the distances. In my own life, yes, you be tough and be stringent and be careful what you do. But I have to realize that the arms of God reach out, and He's a perfect being who is reaching out to the flawed. The uniqueness of the prodigal son story is that as that young boy comes running home, it's not so much that he's come to the end of himself and he's coming home. Anybody here from the East, I ask you this, which of you knows a father in the East who would have left the home and gone running to meet the son because the son had already insulted him a long time before and said, give me my right, I'm walking out of you. That father who left the comfort of his room, knowing the son was on his way, and ran halfway to meet him, shows you the grace and the love and the tenderness of God, meeting you even before you were all the way home because of His love and His embrace for you. That's the mercy. That's the grace of God. This is the unique aspect of the Christian faith. I dare you to show me any other worldview. Any other worldview that does not lean on your works. It's not true in Islam. Your good deeds are going to outweigh your bad deeds if you have to enter paradise. Not true in pantheistic worldviews. The law of karma, every birth is a rebirth, and you pay in each life for the previous life. The Bible tells you and me, my grace is sufficient for thee. It's a life of perfection, reaching out to the flawed. And I think we need to be more gentle and more tolerant of the weaker brother who's floundered and fallen and failed. Until then, such people will never really come back to hear the message. I had a woman once contact me, and she was shattered with the way her daughter's life had gone, completely shattered. She wept and wept. I won't go into what had happened. And she said, I just don't even want to go for this wedding. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be seeing what it is that's happening. She said, Ravi, what do you say? I said, you know, ma'am, you're hurting. I just want to say to you this. If you take your voice out of her life, all you are doing is leaving her within the reach of contrary voices, and your voice will never be heard anymore, except as a voice of rejection. It's hard. It's hard. You and I are flawed. We've stumbled. We find ourselves floundering sometimes. But I want you to know God is a God of grace who reaches out, and we had better be patient also. And number 3, a life of harsh physicality, but the triumph is that of the Spirit. It's a life of harsh physicality, but the triumph is that of the Spirit. What do I mean by that? Every temptation you and I face up to somehow is within this physical frame. Every temptation. And you begin to feel it. You begin to feel it. It's the way life actually goes, the physicality. Does temptation go? No. Does temptation go? No. Lust, greed, pride. These are the three things you and I battle. I want to tie this together in a way that I think is going to be very important for you and for me. C.S. Lewis, in his book Perelandra, makes this incredible comment. And I think it's fascinating about this good, respectable man one day confronted by an unknown presence with an aura of holiness. Listen very carefully. I felt sure that the creature was what we call good, but I wasn't sure whether I really liked goodness so much as I had supposed. This is a very terrible experience. As long as what you're afraid of is something evil, you may still hope that the good may come to your rescue. But suppose you struggle through to the good and find that that is also so dreadful. How if food itself turns out to be the very thing you can't eat, and the home the very place you can't live, and your very comfort of the person who makes you uncomfortable? Then indeed there is no rescue possible. The last card has been played. For a second or two I was nearly in that condition. Here at last was a bit of that world from beyond the world, which I had always supposed that I loved and desired, breaking through and appearing to my senses. And I didn't like it. I wanted it to go away. I wanted every possible distance, gulf, curtain, blanket, and barrier to be placed between it and me. You know, he said, it is quite possible that we will never hear the gospel until we have actually first been made uneasy by it. Goodness can discomfort you. We will never really hear the gospel until you are first made uneasy by it. Michael ended on 2 notes. I want to end on the identical notes, coming to it from a different angle. You know, we think sometimes our belief in God has left us disappointed and we just not thought what it was going to be. Do you know who the loneliest people in the world are? The loneliest people in the world are not those who become weary of pain, but are those who become weary of pleasure. That is the ultimate form of disappointment. When pleasure has nothing left to give to you and to me. We've tried it all, indulged and indulged and indulged. I have talked to people in that very situation. It is the most pitiable condition to be in. Nothing to look forward to for excitement. Such a man was Oscar Wilde. In his 40s, dying in Paris. I visited the hotel. I visited the place where his funeral was held. Ironically, there was no music in his funeral at all. And Oscar Wilde is lying on his bed and he looks at his lover, Robbie Ross, and he says this to him. He said, Robbie, did you ever love any one of those boys for their own sake? Did you ever love any one of those boys for their own sake? He says, no. He says, Robbie, neither did I. Neither did I. Can I ask you why a hedonist is suddenly thinking of loving for somebody else's own sake? He says, bring me a priest. He says, only the blood of Christ is big enough now to cleanse this heart of mine. And if you haven't read his Ballad of Reading Gaol, read it. It's the most brilliant piece of poetry where he talks about how the woman with the alabaster ointment is the only one that could express to him what lostness really meant. And here Wilde gives me a hint. Do you know what that hint is? The ultimate fulfillment in life comes from learning to worship God in spirit and in truth and learning to live within these contrarieties because he loves you for your own sake, just as you serve him for the essence of who he really is. And I close with this. I was in Damascus, Syria, talking to a Muslim cleric. He was the head of the Shiites, Sheikh Hussein. We had about a 3-hour dialogue. I would ask him one question, he would answer it. He would ask me one question, I would answer it. An audience in front. Sitting between us was the interpreter. He was a fine man, a real gentleman. And finally, at the end, he leaned over after I'd shared the story of the gospel and what it meant. And he says to me, Professor Zacharias, he said, maybe it's time for us in the Islamic world. It's a Shiite cleric saying it to me, and I quote him. Sheikh Hussein from Damascus. Maybe it's time for us in the Islamic world to stop asking the question, if Jesus Christ died, and to start asking the question, why? Ladies and gentlemen, with all of the contrarieties we see, nothing is a greater contrariety than the cross of Jesus Christ. Showing his love, taking your pain, and with these tensions that we see within the Christian faith, understand the gospel and what it means. Know his presence in your life personally as he calls us to do, and recognize that at the heart of the gospel is the cross, and without that there is no answer. Both pain and pleasure will disappoint you. That's why the songwriter says, what language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end. O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. There's a wideness in God's mercy which is wider than the sea. There's a kindness in God's justice which is more than liberty. That justice and liberty came together on the cross, and God gives you that same imperative as to how to live it out. For I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. That's the heart of the gospel and transformation. God bless you.
The RZIM Church Leaders Conference is going to address the most timely challenges Christianity is facing. You can attend here in person, or you can register to watch by live stream on rzim.org. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, including Ravi Zacharias, Louis Giglio, John Lennox, Crawford Laritz, Michael Ramsden, Abdu Murray, Sam Alberry, and Joe Vitale. So please join us from October 3rd to the 5th. I hope to see you soon.
People are interested in having a spiritual life, but treat faith more like an a la carte menu at a restaurant, choosing what they like and dismissing the rest. Cutting through the hype and seduction is the clear voice of author and apologist Ravi Zacharias in his book, Why Jesus? Rediscovering His Truth in an Age of Mass-Marketed Spirituality. Ravi answers the attraction known as the New Spirituality. Billy Graham calls Why Jesus a powerful defense of how Jesus Christ brings meaning and hope to an individual life. And Charles Swindoll says, I'm not acquainted with a brighter mind or a more relevant and devoted defender of the faith than Ravi Zacharias. Why Jesus is available in bookstores now or online at rzim.org.
The purpose of RZIM is to engage meaningfully with the questions and heartfelt issues of our culture. We do that in areas of business, academia, politics, the arts, and media. We live in an age of confusion, and people from every continent are beginning to wonder whether there are any answers to life's biggest questions. And RZIM consists of over 50 speakers and adjuncts operating in over 20 countries, working at every level to reach those who shape the culture of a country and its future direction with the gospel. In addition to taking the gospel to various arenas of influence,